A few days ago, something happened that most people barely noticed. No emergency summit, no dramatic press conference, no shouting across microphones, no headlines screaming about crisis. Just a quiet announcement from Ottawa. A 2-day trip to New York. On paper, it looked routine. Another diplomatic visit, another economic conference, another politician speaking to financiers in Manhattan while cameras flash and reporters nod through prepared remarks. But if you look closely, really closely, you realize this was not routine at all. Because Canada is no longer behaving like a country asking for permission. It is behaving like a country preparing for confrontation. Not military confrontation, economic confrontation, strategic confrontation. The kind fought with capital flows, supply chains, investment decisions, and trade leverage. And that changes everything. Because for most of the modern era, Canada's role in the North American relationship was understood in very simple terms. America led. Canada adapted. The United States set the direction of the continental economy, and Canada positioned itself around it. If Washington changed trade policy, Ottawa adjusted. If America entered a boom, Canada benefited. If America entered a recession, Canada absorbed the shock. The imbalance was obvious and undeniable. The United States was the giant market. Canada was the dependent partner. That assumption shaped nearly every major trade negotiation for decades. And now, for the first time in a generation, Canada appears to be testing a different strategy entirely. Not separation from the United States. That would be impossible. But insulation, diversification, optionality. The New York trip matters because it signals something deeper than diplomacy. It signals that Canada's leadership increasingly believes the old economic model is no longer safe enough to rely on exclusively. And the reason is simple. The world has changed. The United States itself has changed. For years, global investors treated America as the unquestioned center of stability. Even during political drama, there was still a broad assumption that the rules of trade, finance, and investment would ultimately remain predictable. But over the past decade, something fundamental shifted. Tariffs returned. Industrial policy returned. Economic nationalism returned. The era of smooth globalization started breaking apart. And nowhere was that more visible than in the relationship between the United States and its allies. Countries that once assumed proximity to America, guaranteed economic security, suddenly discovered that even allies could become targets of tariffs, pressure campaigns, and trade threats. Canada learned that lesson directly. Steel tariffs, aluminum tariffs, threats against auto manufacturing, pressure during trade renegotiations. Repeated reminders that economic integration did not necessarily mean economic protection. That experience left a mark on Ottawa. Because once a country realizes access can be politicized, it starts asking dangerous questions. What happens if the next dispute becomes worse? What happens if Washington becomes more protectionist? What happens if American politics becomes even less predictable? What happens if dependency itself becomes a vulnerability? Those questions are now shaping Canadian strategy in ways most people still underestimate. And that is why this New York visit matters. Because on the surface, Canada is pitching itself to investors. But underneath, it is signaling something much larger. Canada intends to become economically harder to pressure. That is the real story. Look carefully at the language being used. Canada is describing itself as an energy superpower, a critical minerals giant, a stable democratic partner, a reliable long-term investment destination, a low-debt advanced economy, a country positioned at the center of future industrial supply chains. This is not random branding. This is strategic positioning. And the timing is extraordinarily deliberate. Because all of this is happening right before one of the most sensitive trade periods in modern North American history, the review of CUSMA. Most people hear trade agreement review and immediately tune out. Huge mistake. Because this review is not procedural housekeeping, it is leverage testing. To understand why, you have to understand what changed when the old NAFTA system was replaced. The new agreement included a mechanism designed to force periodic political reassessment. Every 6 years, the participating countries effectively have to reconfirm the deal. That means the agreement never becomes politically untouchable. It can always be reopened, always pressured, always renegotiated. And in stable times, that mechanism might seem harmless. But these are not stable times. The United States is entering another era of industrial competition. Tariffs are no longer viewed in Washington as emergency tools. They are increasingly treated as permanent instruments of economic strategy. That changes the atmosphere entirely. Because if tariffs become normalized, then trade agreements stop being guarantees and start becoming battlegrounds. And Canada understands this, which explains the sequencing now unfolding. First, build international investment credibility. Second, attract foreign capital. Third, reduce strategic dependence. Fourth, enter negotiations from a stronger position. That is the pattern. And New York is the perfect stage for it. Think about the symbolism for a moment. Canada is not making this pitch in Toronto, not in Ottawa, not in Vancouver. It is making the pitch in the financial capital of the United States itself, a short distance from Wall Street, in front of the exact institutions that allocate global capital. That is not accidental, because Canada's message is not only directed at investors, it is directed at Washington. The message is, you are no longer the only game in town. That is an extraordinary shift in tone from a country that historically avoided direct economic confrontation with the United States whenever possible. And the centerpiece of this strategy is resources, critical minerals, energy, artificial intelligence infrastructure, electric vehicle supply chains, defense manufacturing. Canada increasingly sees these sectors not simply as industries, but as geopolitical leverage. And honestly, they may be right, because the world is entering a new era of resource competition. The clean energy transition requires enormous quantities of nickel, lithium, cobalt, graphite, copper, and rare materials. AI infrastructure requires massive electricity generation and stable grids. Defense production requires secure industrial supply chains. And Western governments are desperate to reduce reliance on unstable or hostile suppliers. That creates opportunity. Canada's pitch is essentially this: we are politically stable, we are resource-rich, we are geographically secure, we are institutionally trusted, and we are sitting next to the largest market on Earth. That combination is powerful, especially at a moment when investors are increasingly prioritizing resilience over pure efficiency. For decades, globalization rewarded whoever was cheapest. Now the world increasingly rewards whoever is safest. That shift benefits countries like Canada enormously, and Canadian leadership clearly understands that. But here is the truly fascinating part. Canada is not trying to decouple from America. That would be impossible economically. Instead, it is attempting something much more realistic and much more intelligent. It is trying to make itself indispensable. That distinction matters. A dependent country asks for market access. An indispensable country becomes too strategically valuable to ignore. And Canada's leadership increasingly appears focused on moving from the first category toward the second. That is why defense spending is rising. That is why critical mineral strategies are expanding. That is why infrastructure corridors are being discussed. That is why international partnerships are multiplying simultaneously across Europe and the Indo-Pacific. This is not random policy activity. It is repositioning. A slow but deliberate attempt to redefine Canada's role in the emerging global order. And whether people realize it or not, this represents one of the most significant strategic transitions in modern Canadian economic history. Because for generations, Canada's economic philosophy was built around proximity to the United States. Now, the philosophy appears to be evolving towards something different. Proximity plus diversification. Access plus independence. Integration without vulnerability. That is the balancing act. And it is extraordinarily difficult. Because the truth is, Canada still depends heavily on the American market. Geography does not disappear. Supply chains do not reorganize overnight. Trade realities remain enormous. The United States still possesses vastly greater leverage in any direct confrontation. But leverage is not binary. It exists on a spectrum. And even modest reductions in dependence can significantly strengthen a country's negotiating position. That is what this strategy is really about. Not defeating American influence, diluting it, creating alternatives, creating flexibility, creating fallback options. And perhaps most importantly, creating uncertainty in Washington about how much pressure Canada can absorb before adapting elsewhere. That alone changes negotiations. Because power is not only about size, it is about resilience. And resilience is exactly what Canada is now selling, to investors, allies, and perhaps even to itself. Which brings us back to New York. The speech itself will likely sound calm, professional, technical, optimistic. But beneath the polished language sits a much harder reality. Canada is quietly preparing for a world where economic alliances are less permanent, trade disputes are more frequent, and strategic self-sufficiency matters more than it has in decades. That is the real significance of this moment. Not one speech, not one trip, not one investment summit, but the emergence of a new Canadian mindset. A mindset that no longer assumes the global system will remain stable by default. A mindset that increasingly believes economic security must be actively constructed. And perhaps most importantly, a mindset that believes Canada can no longer afford to define its future entirely through Washington's decisions. Whether this strategy succeeds is another question entirely. Because ambition and execution are not the same thing. Canada still faces enormous internal obstacles: regulatory delays, infrastructure bottlenecks, productivity concerns, housing pressures, slow project approvals, political fragmentation. If those problems are not solved, the investment vision could stall. But regardless of outcome, the strategic shift itself is real. And history may eventually look back on this period as the moment Canada stopped thinking of itself merely as America's economic partner and started trying to become a strategic power in its own right.